July 15th, 1990, Cedar Creek, Texas. For 33 years, a killer walked free while a family waited for justice that seemed would never come. In the scorching summer of 1990, the small town of Cedar Creek, Texas, population barely 8,000, was about to become the epicenter of one of the state's most baffling cold cases. A case so complex that it would take cutting-edge DNA technology, FBI intervention, and the relentless pursuit of truth to finally bring a monster to justice. This is the story of how modern science caught up with an old evil, how a single strand of DNA became the key that unlocked decades of silence, and how a breakthrough in 2023 would finally answer the question that had haunted an entire community. Who killed 22-year-old Rebecca Martinez? But before we dive into the science that solved this case, we need to go back. Back to a time when DNA evidence was still in its infancy. Back to a hot July night when a young woman's life was brutally cut short. Back to the beginning of a mystery that would span 3 decades. Cedar Creek in 1990 was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Located 40 miles southeast of Dallas, it was a tight-knit community where families had lived for generations. The kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The economy revolved around agriculture and small businesses. Main Street was lined with family-owned shops that had been passed down through generations. The local diner served as the unofficial town hall, where news traveled faster than wildfire and secrets were harder to keep than anywhere else. But beneath this picture-perfect facade, Cedar Creek was experiencing the growing pains that many small Texas towns faced as the 1990s began. The younger generation was leaving for bigger cities. Drug problems that had once seemed like distant urban issues were creeping into rural communities. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life was slowly eroding. Into this changing landscape stepped Rebecca Martinez, a vibrant 22-year-old who had recently moved to Cedar Creek to start fresh. She was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with long dark hair and an infectious smile, Rebecca had dreams bigger than the small town she now called home. Rebecca worked at the local bank during the day and took evening classes at the community college, determined to build a better future for herself. She lived alone in a small apartment on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from downtown. Her neighbors described her as friendly but cautious, someone who always locked her doors and was aware of her surroundings. She had moved to Cedar Creek from Houston after a difficult breakup, seeking the peace and safety that small-town life promised. Her family worried about her living alone, but Rebecca was independent and strong-willed. She called her mother every Sunday without fail and visited her family in Houston once a month. Rebecca's routine was predictable and safe. She worked Monday through Friday at First National Bank of Cedar Creek, where she had quickly become a favorite among customers and colleagues alike. Her supervisor later described her as reliable, honest, and ambitious. She never missed work and was always the first to volunteer for extra responsibilities. On weekends, Rebecca could be found at the local library, studying for her business administration courses, or at Miller's Cafe, grading papers for the tutoring work she did on the side. She was saving money to eventually transfer to a 4-year university, determined to earn her bachelor's degree. But Rebecca's carefully constructed new life was about to be shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. On the night of July 15, 1990, someone would enter her world with deadly intentions. Someone who had been watching, waiting, planning. What happened that night would not only end a young woman's promising life, but would also expose the limitations of 1990s forensic science. It would reveal how a killer could hide in plain sight for decades, protected by the very technology that would eventually bring him down. This is the story of how patience, persistence, and scientific breakthrough finally delivered justice. how the FBI's advanced DNA database would crack a case that had stumped local investigators for over 3 decades, and how Rebecca Martinez would finally get the justice she deserved. But first, we must return to that fateful night in July 1990 when Cedar Creek lost its innocence forever. July 1990 marked one of the hottest summers on record in East Texas. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for weeks, and the drought had turned the once green pastures surrounding Cedar Creek into brittle, brown expanses that cracked under the relentless sun. The town itself seemed to shimmer in the heat waves that rose from the asphalt streets. Air conditioning units hummed constantly, straining electrical grids that weren't designed for such sustained demand. People moved slower, spoke less, and sought shade wherever they could find it. Cedar Creek had been founded in 1887 by German and Czech immigrants who were drawn to the fertile soil and abundant water sources. By 1990, it retained much of its old-world charm. Victorian houses lined the residential streets, their wraparound porches offering respite from the heat. Ancient oak trees provided natural canopies over sidewalks where children still played hopscotch and rode bicycles. The town square featured a courthouse built in 1902, its red brick facade weathered but dignified. Around the square, local businesses thrived in a simpler time before big box stores and chain restaurants would change the landscape forever. Henderson's Hardware had been serving the community since 1923. The Cedar Creek Chronicle, the weekly newspaper, operated from a building that had housed the publication for over 60 years. Main Street buzzed with familiar faces and predictable routines. Mrs. Patterson opened her flower shop at 8 sharp every morning. The barber, old Mr. Rodriguez, could be seen sweeping his sidewalk before the first customer arrived. The postal workers knew every resident by name and often served as informal messengers for community news. But beneath this Norman Rockwell exterior, Cedar Creek was experiencing subtle changes that would prove significant to the events that were about to unfold. The completion of Interstate 45 had brought the town closer to Houston, making it an attractive option for people seeking small-town life while maintaining access to big city opportunities. This accessibility had attracted a new demographic to Cedar Creek. Young professionals like Rebecca Martinez were discovering the town's charm and affordability. The population had grown by 15% in the past 5 years, bringing fresh faces and new energy, but also disrupting the close-knit social fabric that had defined the community for generations. The local police force, headed by Chief William Morrison, consisted of just 6 officers who patrolled the town in 2 squad cars. Crime was typically limited to minor infractions: teenagers drinking beer behind the high school, occasional domestic disputes, and the rare burglary. The most serious incident in recent memory had been a bar fight that resulted in a broken nose and hurt feelings. Chief Morrison, a Cedar Creek native who had returned home after serving in the Dallas Police Department, often joked that his biggest challenge was staying awake during the quiet night shifts. The police station occupied a small building next to the fire department, and the 2 emergency services shared resources and personnel when needed. Rebecca Martinez had arrived in Cedar Creek 6 months earlier, in January 1990. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment in the Maple Grove complex, a modest development built in the 1970s to accommodate the town's gradual growth. The complex consisted of 12 units arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a small courtyard with a swimming pool that had seen better days. Her neighbors included elderly couple Harold and Marge Wilson, who had lived in the complex since it opened. They kept an eye on the younger residents and often brought homemade cookies to newcomers. Across the courtyard lived David Chen, a computer programmer who commuted to Dallas 3 days a week, and Linda Foster, a divorced mother of 2 who worked at the elementary school. The apartment complex sat on the edge of town, where residential areas gave way to farmland and wooded areas. It was quiet and safe, with good lighting and secure locks on all doors. The landlord, Bob Martinez, no relation to Rebecca despite sharing a surname, was diligent about maintenance and security. Rebecca had quickly integrated into the community fabric. She joined the Cedar Creek Community Church, where she volunteered to help with the children's Sunday school program. Her warm personality and genuine interest in others made her popular among both longtime residents and fellow newcomers. At First National Bank, Rebecca worked as a customer service representative and part-time loan officer. The bank, established in 1952, served as the financial heart of the community. President Margaret Thompson had hired Rebecca after being impressed by her banking experience in Houston and her commitment to continuing her education. The bank occupied a single-story brick building on Main Street, directly across from the courthouse. Large windows faced the street, allowing natural light to illuminate the lobby where customers conducted their business. Rebecca's desk was positioned near the front, where she greeted visitors with her characteristic smile and helpful demeanor. Her evening routine was consistent and predictable. After work, she would drive home to her apartment, change into comfortable clothes, and either attend her business classes at Cedar Creek Community College or spend time studying at the kitchen table she had converted into a makeshift desk. This peaceful existence was about to be shattered forever. July 15, 1990, began like any other sweltering summer day in Cedar Creek. Rebecca Martinez followed her usual routine, arriving at First National Bank at 8:30 in the morning and greeting customers with her characteristic warmth despite the oppressive heat that had already settled over the town. The day passed without incident. Rebecca processed loan applications, helped elderly customers with their banking needs, and discussed weekend plans with her colleagues. At 5 o'clock sharp, she gathered her purse and textbooks, said goodbye to her co-workers, and walked to her car parked behind the bank. Security cameras captured Rebecca leaving the bank parking lot at 5:15. She drove straight home to Maple Grove Apartments, where neighbor Harold Wilson later recalled seeing her carry her books up the stairs to her second-floor unit. She waved and smiled, just as she always did. Rebecca had planned to spend the evening studying for an upcoming exam in her business finance course. Her mother in Houston expected their usual Sunday phone call, just 2 days away. Her life was moving forward exactly as she had planned when she made the brave decision to start over in Cedar Creek. At approximately 6:30, Rebecca called Chen's Garden, a small Chinese restaurant on Main Street, and placed an order for delivery. The restaurant owner, Mr. Chen, remembered the order clearly because Rebecca was one of his regular customers and always tipped generously. Sweet and sour chicken with fried rice, her usual meal when she planned to study late into the evening. The delivery driver, 17-year-old Marcus Williams, arrived at Maple Grove Apartments at 7:15. He knocked on Rebecca's door, and she answered promptly, paying for her meal and adding her customary $3 tip. Marcus later told investigators that Rebecca seemed normal and cheerful, asking about his summer job and wishing him a good evening. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Martinez alive. What happened next remains partially shrouded in mystery, but forensic evidence would later paint a terrifying picture of the violence that unfolded in apartment 2B that night. Sometime between 8 and 10 o'clock, an intruder gained access to Rebecca's apartment. The method of entry puzzled investigators from the beginning. There were no signs of forced entry at the front door, and the sliding glass door leading to the small balcony remained locked from the inside. The windows showed no evidence of tampering. The attack was swift and brutal. Rebecca's textbooks were found scattered across the living room floor, suggesting she had been studying at her kitchen table when the assault began. Her dinner container sat half empty on the counter, chopsticks still resting beside it. The medical examiner would later determine that Rebecca had fought desperately for her life. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated she had struggled against her attacker. The apartment showed signs of a violent confrontation, with furniture overturned and personal belongings strewn across the floor. Rebecca Martinez died from strangulation. The killer had used a ligature, likely a rope or cord, to end her life. The medical examiner estimated the attack lasted between 10 and 15 minutes, during which Rebecca endured unimaginable terror before succumbing to her injuries. The killer had made deliberate attempts to destroy evidence. Rebecca's body was found in the bedroom, positioned in a way that suggested the perpetrator had spent time at the scene after the murder. Investigators discovered that several items were missing from the apartment, including Rebecca's purse, jewelry, and a small amount of cash she kept in a kitchen drawer. Most disturbing to investigators was the calculated nature of the crime. The killer had taken time to clean certain surfaces and remove potential evidence. However, in 1990, forensic science was limited in its ability to detect trace evidence that would prove crucial decades later. The discovery came the following morning when Rebecca failed to report to work. Margaret Thompson, the bank president, became concerned when Rebecca didn't answer her phone. This was completely out of character for someone who had never missed a day of work and always called if she was running late. Thompson contacted the apartment complex manager, who agreed to perform a welfare check. At 11:30, on the morning of July 16, 1990, Rebecca Martinez was found dead in her bedroom, launching an investigation that would consume the Cedar Creek Police Department and haunt the community for the next 33 years. The killer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a devastated family, a terrified community, and a mystery that would challenge every investigator who touched the case. The discovery of Rebecca Martinez's body sent shockwaves through Cedar Creek's small police department. Chief William Morrison had never investigated a homicide during his 5 years leading the force. The most serious crimes he had handled were burglaries and domestic disputes. Suddenly, his department was thrust into the spotlight of a brutal murder investigation. Morrison immediately called for assistance from the Texas Rangers and the Harris County Sheriff's Department. Within hours, the quiet apartment complex was swarming with investigators, forensic technicians, and crime scene photographers. The parking lot filled with official vehicles, drawing curious neighbors and local media to the scene. Detective Ray Hutchinson from Harris County took the lead on the investigation. A 20-year veteran with experience in major crimes, Hutchinson brought expertise that the Cedar Creek Department lacked. However, even his experience couldn't overcome the limitations of 1990s forensic science and the mistakes that would plague the early investigation. The first critical error occurred during the initial crime scene processing. In 1990, DNA analysis was still in its infancy and not routinely used in criminal investigations. The forensic team focused on traditional evidence collection, fingerprints, photographs, and witness statements. Biological evidence was collected but not properly preserved according to standards that would be developed years later. Investigators found several fingerprints throughout the apartment, but the majority belonged to Rebecca herself or were too smudged to be useful. A partial print on the kitchen counter couldn't be matched to anyone in the limited databases available at the time. Without modern fingerprint identification systems, this potentially crucial evidence led nowhere. The investigation initially focused on Rebecca's personal life. Detectives interviewed her family in Houston, searching for ex-boyfriends, disgruntled acquaintances, or anyone who might have harbored ill will toward the young woman. They discovered that Rebecca had ended a relationship with Michael Rodriguez before moving to Cedar Creek. But Rodriguez had a solid alibi and willingly submitted to questioning. Investigators also examined Rebecca's co-workers and customers at First National Bank. The theory emerged that someone might have targeted her after observing her routine or learning about her living situation through banking interactions. However, This line of inquiry produced no viable suspects, despite extensive interviews with bank employees and regular customers. The lack of forced entry puzzled investigators and led to their second major mistake. Detective Hutchinson theorized that Rebecca knew her killer and had willingly allowed the person into her apartment. This assumption narrowed the investigation focus to people within Rebecca's social circle, potentially overlooking a stranger who had found another way to gain entry. A maintenance worker named Carlos Mendez became the first person of interest. Mendez had access to all apartment units and had performed routine repairs in Rebecca's apartment 2 weeks before the murder. He was questioned extensively and subjected to a polygraph test, which he failed. However, Mendez had been working at another apartment complex across town on the night of the murder, with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. The investigation's third significant error involved the handling of witness testimony. Several residents reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles in the apartment complex parking lot during the weeks leading up to the murder. However, these reports were inconsistent and poorly documented. No systematic canvass was conducted to identify and interview all potential witnesses in the surrounding area. Marcus Williams, the delivery driver who had seen Rebecca alive, became another focus of suspicion. His youth and nervous demeanor during questioning raised red flags for investigators. Williams was interrogated multiple times and asked to take a polygraph test. The stress of being treated as a suspect caused the teenager to give inconsistent statements, further arousing suspicion. The investigation consumed enormous resources over the first 6 months. The Texas Rangers assigned 2 full-time investigators to the case. The Cedar Creek Police Department exhausted its annual overtime budget by September. Despite these efforts, no arrests were made, and the leads gradually dried up. By Christmas 1990, the Rebecca Martinez murder investigation had stalled completely. The case file contained hundreds of pages of reports, witness statements, and forensic analyses, but no clear suspect had emerged. The killer had seemingly vanished without leaving behind any useful evidence. The investigation's failures would haunt law enforcement for decades, serving as a painful reminder of how a combination of limited technology, investigative missteps, and bad luck could allow a killer to escape justice. By 1992, the Rebecca Martinez murder case had officially gone cold. The active investigation was suspended and the thick case file was relegated to a storage room in the Cedar Creek Police Department. Detective Ray Hutchinson returned to Harris County, carrying with him the frustration of an unsolved case that had consumed 2 years of his career. The impact on Cedar Creek was profound and lasting. The sense of safety that had defined the small town for over a century was shattered. Residents who had never locked their doors began installing deadbolts and security systems. Women, particularly those living alone, altered their daily routines and avoided going out after dark. The Maple Grove Apartments, once considered a desirable place to live, struggled to maintain occupancy. Rebecca's former apartment remained vacant for over a year before the landlord finally found a tenant willing to overlook its dark history. Several longtime residents moved away, unable to shake the feeling that a killer might still be lurking in their community. Rebecca's family refused to let her memory fade. Her mother, Elena Martinez, became a tireless advocate for keeping the case in the public eye. Every year, on the anniversary of Rebecca's death, Elena would drive from Houston to Cedar Creek, placing flowers at the small memorial that had been erected in the town square. She wrote letters to newspapers, contacted television producers, and pleaded with anyone who would listen to keep investigating her daughter's murder. The Cedar Creek Chronicle published annual remembrance articles, keeping Rebecca's story alive in the community consciousness. Local churches held memorial services, and the high school established a scholarship in Rebecca's name for students pursuing business degrees. These efforts ensured that Rebecca Martinez would not be forgotten, even as the years passed without answers. Chief Morrison retired in 1995, haunted by his department's inability to solve the case. His successor, Chief Patricia Williams, inherited the cold case file and made periodic attempts to revive the investigation. She sent evidence to the newly established Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Lab for analysis. But the limited DNA technology of the mid-1990s yielded no new leads. The case attracted attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts as the internet age dawned. Online forums dedicated to unsolved murders featured lengthy discussions about Rebecca's case. Armchair detectives proposed theories and analyzed evidence, but their efforts produced more speculation than actionable leads. In 2000, the case received renewed attention when a similar murder occurred in a neighboring county. A young woman living alone was strangled in her apartment with no signs of forced entry. Investigators explored potential connections between the cases, but forensic analysis revealed different perpetrators. The brief surge of hope in Cedar Creek quickly faded. The Martinez family's persistence paid off in small ways over the years. They convinced local television stations to feature Rebecca's case on anniversary broadcasts. A Houston newspaper published a lengthy investigative series in 2005, examining the original investigation and calling for new efforts to solve the murder. These media appearances generated tips and leads, but none proved fruitful. As technology advanced, the case file was periodically reviewed by new investigators. In 2010, Detective Amanda Foster of the Cedar Creek Police Department took a fresh look at the evidence. She arranged for additional DNA testing using improved techniques, but the results were inconclusive due to the degraded condition of the biological samples. By 2020, 30 years had passed since Rebecca's murder. Most of the original investigators had retired or died. The case had been reviewed by dozens of detectives, but the killer's identity remained a mystery. The town of Cedar Creek had grown and changed, but the shadow of the unsolved murder continued to loom over the community. Elena Martinez, now in her 70s, never stopped believing that justice would eventually prevail. Her faith would soon be rewarded in ways she never could have imagined. In January 2023, Detective Maria Santos of the Cedar Creek Police Department made a decision that would finally bring justice to Rebecca Martinez. Santos, a forensic science graduate who had joined the department 2 years earlier, believed that advances in DNA technology might hold the key to solving the 33-year-old cold case. Santos contacted the FBI's Combined DNA Index System laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. The CODIS database had expanded dramatically since its inception, now containing over 20 million DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and unsolved crime scenes across the United States. More importantly, new techniques in genetic genealogy were revolutionizing cold case investigations nationwide. The FBI agreed to re-examine the biological evidence collected from Rebecca's apartment in 1990. Using advanced extraction methods, forensic scientists were able to recover a complete DNA profile from a microscopic sample that had been overlooked for decades. The sample came from beneath Rebecca's fingernails, where she had likely scratched her attacker during the struggle. The DNA profile was immediately run through CODIS, but no direct match was found. However, the FBI's Genetic Genealogy Unit, established in 2019, offered a new approach. They uploaded the unknown DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used by millions of people researching their family histories. The genetic genealogy search identified several distant relatives of the unknown suspect. FBI genealogist Dr. Rebecca Chen began the painstaking process of building family trees and identifying potential suspects. The work required analyzing hundreds of family connections spanning multiple generations and geographic locations. After 6 weeks of intensive research, Dr. Chen narrowed the possibilities to 3 potential suspects: All were men who would have been adults in 1990 and had some connection to the Cedar Creek area. The most promising candidate was 47-year-old Robert Mitchell, a construction worker who had lived in nearby Huntsville in 1990. Detective Santos discovered that Mitchell had worked for a roofing company that had contracts throughout East Texas in the summer of 1990. Company records, stored in a warehouse for over 3 decades, showed that Mitchell's crew had performed repairs on several buildings in Cedar Creek during June and July 1990, including work at a shopping center just 2 blocks from Rebecca's apartment. The investigation revealed disturbing details about Mitchell's background. He had been arrested multiple times for domestic violence and assault, but had never been convicted of a felony, which explained why his DNA wasn't in CODIS. Court records showed a pattern of violence against women spanning decades. Mitchell had moved frequently over the years, living in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. He had worked various construction jobs, often leaving towns abruptly when legal troubles arose. In 2018, he had been arrested for aggravated assault in Little Rock, but was released on bail and subsequently disappeared. The FBI launched a nationwide manhunt for Mitchell in March 2023. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country, and his information was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. The search focused on areas where Mitchell had previously lived and worked. The breakthrough came on April 15, 2023, when Mitchell was arrested during a routine traffic stop in Shreveport, Louisiana. He had been living under an assumed name and working at a construction site using false identification. A background check revealed the outstanding warrant from Arkansas, leading to his detention. Detective Santos and FBI agents traveled to Louisiana to interview Mitchell and collect a DNA sample. The suspect initially denied any knowledge of Rebecca Martinez or Cedar Creek, claiming he had never been to the town. However, when confronted with evidence of his work history in the area, Mitchell requested an attorney and refused to answer further questions. The DNA comparison confirmed what investigators already suspected. Robert Mitchell's DNA was a perfect match to the sample recovered from beneath Rebecca's fingernails. After 33 years, the man who had brutally murdered Rebecca Martinez was finally in custody. The arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Creek and brought overwhelming relief to the Martinez family, who had waited more than 3 decades for this moment. The news of Robert Mitchell's arrest spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire on April 16, 2023. Within hours of the official announcement, the small town that had lived under the shadow of an unsolved murder for 33 years was buzzing with a mixture of relief, vindication, and renewed grief for Rebecca Martinez. The Cedar Creek Chronicle, the same newspaper that had faithfully covered the case for over 3 decades, published a special edition with the headline, "Justice at Last, DNA Breakthrough Solves 1990 Murder." The story dominated local television news broadcasts, with reporters interviewing longtime residents who remembered the fear that had gripped their community in the summer of 1990. Elena Martinez, now 74 years old, received the call from Detective Santos at her Houston home. After more than 3 decades of waiting, the mother who had never stopped fighting for justice finally heard the word she had prayed for. Her daughter's killer had been caught. Elena's first reaction was not celebration, but overwhelming relief that she had lived long enough to see this day. The Martinez family held a press conference outside the Harris County Courthouse, where Elena stood flanked by her surviving children and grandchildren who had grown up knowing their aunt only through photographs and stories. Elena's voice trembled as she thanked the investigators who had never given up on Rebecca's case, particularly Detective Santos and the FBI team whose scientific expertise had finally identified the killer. In Cedar Creek, the reaction was equally emotional. Harold Wilson, now 91 years old and one of the few remaining residents who had known Rebecca personally, wept when he heard the news. He had never forgotten the young woman who had always waved and smiled when she saw him in the apartment complex courtyard. The Maple Grove apartments, where Rebecca had lived and died, had changed ownership several times over the years. The current residents organized a memorial gathering in the courtyard, placing flowers and candles near the spot where Rebecca's apartment had been located. Many attendees were too young to remember the original crime, but had grown up hearing the story from their parents and grandparents. Chief Patricia Williams, who had inherited the cold case in 1995 and had overseen multiple failed attempts to solve it, expressed profound gratitude for the technological advances that had finally brought closure. She praised Detective Santos for her persistence and credited the FBI's genetic genealogy program with revolutionizing cold case investigations. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once Mitchell was extradited to Texas. Faced with overwhelming DNA evidence, his defense attorney advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than face a potential death penalty at trial. In September 2023, Robert Mitchell pleaded guilty to the first-degree murder of Rebecca Martinez and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the sentencing hearing, previously sealed court documents revealed the full scope of Mitchell's criminal history. Investigators had linked him to at least 3 other unsolved cases involving attacks on women in Texas and Louisiana during the 1990s. The FBI announced that they would be reopening these cases and using genetic genealogy to determine if Mitchell was responsible for additional crimes. The resolution of Rebecca's case sparked a renewed interest in cold case investigations throughout Texas. The state legislature allocated additional funding for DNA testing and genetic genealogy research, recognizing the potential to solve hundreds of unsolved murders and sexual assaults. The Rebecca Martinez Cold Case Initiative was established to provide resources and training for law enforcement agencies seeking to apply these new technologies. Detective Santos became a national spokesperson for genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, speaking at conferences and training seminars across the country. She emphasized that Rebecca's case demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence and never giving up on victims who deserved justice, regardless of how much time had passed. The town of Cedar Creek dedicated a permanent memorial to Rebecca Martinez in the town square, replacing the small plaque that had marked her memory for decades. The new monument featured Rebecca's photograph and an inscription that read, "In memory of Rebecca Martinez, whose life was taken too soon, but whose story reminds us that justice, though delayed, will not be denied." Elena Martinez lived to see her daughter's killer sentenced, but passed away peacefully in her sleep just 3 months later, in December 2023. Her family said she had finally found peace, knowing that Rebecca's murderer would never hurt another person. The case that had haunted Cedar Creek for 33 years was finally closed, but its impact would be felt for generations. Rebecca Martinez had become more than a victim. She had become a symbol of perseverance, technological progress, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In the end, science had caught up with evil, and a small Texas town could finally heal from a wound that had never properly closed.